Goldie noticed that her husband has been behaving very strangely for some time now. Jeffrey attributed it to his heavy workload. His job seemed to have become the meaning of his life recently. Having become the director of the firm that used to belong to Goldie's father, Jeffrey was ready to literally spend his nights in the office. However, when Goldie called the security guard late at night, it turned out that Jeffrey wasn't there. Moreover, according to the man, the director always left work on time, and sometimes even before everyone else. Goldie got anxious when she realized that her husband was lying to her, and in the most shameless way too. At that moment, the woman remembered the words of her late father spoken by him shortly before his death. "Goldie, be careful. Trust Jeffrey so much that he has the power to hurt you. I could be wrong, of course, but I don't think this man is who he claims to be." Goldie didn't pay much attention to her father's words at the time, thinking that the insidious disease was to blame for his attitude. It had been taking a lot of strength and energy from the man at that point. Hugo Rogers had achieved everything in his life that he could have ever dreamed of. He had a successful company, which brought the owner a stable income, and an impressive bank account, which became kind of insurance for him. Since Hugo's wife died 7 years ago, his only family was his daughter. Goldie graduated from Yale University and was very proud of the fact that she did it on her own, without any help from her father. Mr. Rogers felt that his daughter had the same business mindset that he did, which allowed him to build a successful business. Goldie loved her father very much and tried to help him with everything, especially after Hugo Rogers started showing signs of a terrible hereditary disease. Unfortunately, neither the businessman's money nor his connections could save him from the health problems he'd suddenly developed. Even during his lifetime, Hugo Rogers disliked his daughter's partner for some inexplicable reason. He felt that he was a scammer who charmed his naive and gullible daughter. The animosity turned out to be mutual, and looking into Jeffrey's eyes, it was obvious that he was simply waiting for the day when his father-in-law would pass away. After the death of his father-in-law, the young man immediately cheered up, and taking advantage of his wife's disorientation, became the head of her father's firm. In all fairness, it should be said that Goldie didn't really object to her husband's decision to take over the management of the family business. The woman was grieving her father's passing and couldn't find the strength to correctly assess the current situation. According to the official documents, Hugo Rogers' firm was owned by his daughter, while all Jeffrey could do was manage it. Things went on like this until he started deceiving Goldie, who was too naive to notice that something was wrong until it was too late. Jeffrey used the firm's money for his personal needs. Expensive cars, casinos, and women filled the man's life and clouded his mind, turning him into an ordinary playboy. Having finally noticed that Jeffrey was behaving strangely, Goldie arranged for an audit of all the company accounts and quickly learned of many violations committed with the connivance of her husband. Did he really marry me just for the money? The woman wondered, having a hard time holding back her tears. Goldie tried talking to her husband that same evening, asking him all the questions that bothered her, but she never got a cohesive answer out of him. Jeffrey stubbornly refused to admit that he was spending the company's money on casinos and women. Since we obviously can't get anywhere in this conversation, I'm going to take the position of the company director. So from now on, I will personally control all of the company transactions. In case you forgot, I'm actually the one who owns this firm, Goldie concluded in an icy tone. Jeffrey immediately lost his ardor and asked for his wife's forgiveness with an ingratiating smile on his face. "You know what, dear? I really did go too far. I'm sorry, I've made some mistakes. Let's take a break from everything and go camping. When we come back, we can take over the company and manage it as you see fit," Jeffrey added, carefully trying not to aggravate his wife even more. Her husband's suggestion caught Goldie off guard and touched her heart. Maybe there's still a chance for us. Maybe we should try going camping and spending some time together, the woman thought, having agreed to her husband's proposal. The next day, they drove off in Jeffrey's minivan towards the nearest forest, which was just outside the city. The forest and plains of Wyoming had always been rightfully considered one of the most beautiful places in the country, and being a native of this state, Goldie couldn't agree more. Having turned onto the forest road, Jeffrey drove the car confidently, as if he'd been there before. Goldie gave her husband a great smile and caught herself thinking that she was feeling truly happy. Spending time out in nature with her beloved husband. What could be better? Goldie got so distracted by her daydreaming that she didn't even realize how deep into the forest Jeffrey had taken her. "Honey, do you think we've gone too far?" the woman asked anxiously. "No, of course not. Sure, we've gone deep into the forest, but I think it's the best place for camping. Let's get a fire started and I'll go gather some mushrooms so we can cook some soup and you can start frying the meat in the meantime," Jeffrey suggested. Goldie shrugged but didn't argue with her husband. She didn't know her way around mushrooms and could hardly distinguish between a fly agaric and a chapinian. Meanwhile, Jeffrey quickly filled about a third of the camping pot with mushrooms, after which he set it on the campfire. Then he helped Goldie fry the meat, which smelled so good that the couple immediately started feeling very hungry. When it was time for the meal, Jeffrey handed his wife a bowl of mushroom broth while he ate the pork steak. The tart taste of the mushroom soup seemed rather strange to the woman, but she didn't question her husband's culinary abilities and rather quickly dealt with the portion her husband gave her. Jeffrey was very uninhibited and kept making jokes and looking at his wife questioningly from time to time. At first, everything was going great, but then suddenly, Goldie started feeling dizzy and seeing double. "Something doesn't feel right," the woman said, turning pale and pressing her back against the tree. Jeffrey stepped closer and looked straight into the woman's eyes when he said, "No, everything's going as it should. Mushrooms, they never fail. The most important thing to know is which ones to pick, and I'm really good at it." Goldie turned even paler. "What do you mean? Why are you talking about mushrooms?" Reveling in the feeling of his own superiority, Jeffrey smiled smugly, after which he said, "The mushrooms you ate were poisonous. Without medical assistance, you'll be dead in a couple of hours. And since there's no one here to help you, I consider our problem solved. In a few days, I'll report you missing to the police, then your car will be found outside the city. I'll make sure it burns down before it's found. Inside, they will find the charred body of some homeless woman from the local morgue." It was only then that Goldie realized what her husband was up to. "No, you wouldn't. I don't believe you," the woman said in a weakening voice. But Jeffrey paid no attention to his wife's words. Instead of helping Goldie, he put out the fire as if nothing had happened and took out a shovel from the trunk of his car. "What do you think? That I would leave you to be eaten by wolves or foxes?" the man explained, starting to dig. Bitter tears were flowing down Goldie's cheeks, leaving thin, salty traces on her pale skin. The poison made the woman lose almost all control of her legs and arms, which made it very difficult for her to do anything. Nevertheless, Goldie tried crawling towards the nearest bushes, hoping to hide behind them and avoid getting buried in the dense forest. Throwing a mocking glance at his wife, Jeffrey called after her. "You can crawl all you want, but there's no hiding from me." But Goldie intended to fight till her last breath. Thus, she continued to crawl, even though her hands were already bleeding. At one point, she felt as if she'd been crawling for over a mile, but in reality, it was only a few yards. Having dug out the hole, Jeffrey caught up with his wife in no time and was about to lift her from the ground when suddenly he heard a dog barking nearby. The man turned pale and distinctly heard the sound of branches crackling somewhere close. Realizing that the dog could be there with its owner, Jeffrey left his wife to the mercy of fate and hurried to get to his car. Goldie lay on the damp ground. Desperately struggling with nausea and dizziness, she tried to call out for help, but all she managed to get out was some indistinct wheezing. which was simply impossible to hear. But when Goldie had already completely lost heart, a huge dog jumped out of the thickets, joyfully squealing and wagging its tail. The dog was followed by a man in a camouflage uniform and a cap with the forest ranger emblem. Having noticed Goldie, the stranger stepped closer and bent over her body. "Mushrooms. I hate poisonous mushrooms," the woman managed to whisper before losing consciousness. Goldie didn't remember much of what happened next. Her body suddenly left the ground and soared into the air as if by magic. Swinging on the waves of oblivion, Goldie thought that she had already died, and her soul was doomed to eternal wandering between heaven and earth. Of course, the woman didn't know that what she was feeling was her savior carrying her in his arms for about 2 miles, after which he put her to bed and called the doctor he knew. Lionel Hayes was considered to be an expert of all kinds of poisons, and therefore he immediately knew what he had to do next. He pumped the woman's stomach, after which he put an IV and gave her a shot of an antidote. "That's much better, Sean. You found this poor woman just in time. Another hour and I would have been powerless. By the way, how's Billy doing? Any improvements?" Mr. Hayes asked. The ranger looked at the old man and said, No improvements, unfortunately. He's still limping. They say that there's a surgery he could get at the hospital in New York, but it costs a lot of money. And I also have Amanda's sick mother to take care of. I don't know what to do first." Lionel Hayes shook his head sympathetically and headed for the exit. He was well aware of the situation Sean Williams was in. He'd lost his wife in a car accident 2 years ago. Unfortunately, his 5-year-old Billy was in the car with her at the time. His leg was injured by the mangled car door. Despite all the misfortunes that befell the man, Sean never gave up and tried to help his little son get rid of his lameness by any means necessary. Moreover, Lionel Hayes was the only one who knew that Billy used to live at an orphanage until Amanda and Sean Williams adopted him, because they couldn't have their own children. During all this time, Sean never once gave his son reason to suspect that Sean wasn't his biological father. And now, when his dad brought home a seemingly lifeless woman, Billy came limping over and gently touched the guest's shoulder with his hand. Goldie barely managed to open her eyes and saw a sweet, freckled, childish face in front of her. Dad, she woke up!" Billy exclaimed happily. Having a hard time restraining his excitement, Sean came closer and immediately realized that his son was right. "Where am I? What happened to me?" Goldie whispered, moving her lips with difficulty. "You're in a safe place, miss. No one's going to hurt you here or feed you poisonous mushrooms," Sean reassured the woman. The realization of what had happened broke Goldie's heart, plunging her into an abyss of despair and contempt for Jeffrey. "I need to get back to the city as soon as possible. My husband, he's got this evil plan," Goldie said and tried to get out of bed. "No, ma'am, you can't go anywhere yet. Mr. Hayes said that you need to stay in bed for at least another day," the young ranger said in a tone that brooked no objections. Then he gave the guest all the medicine the doctor prescribed and sat down beside her. Sean wasn't a curious man, and therefore he didn't ask for an explanation from the woman. But Goldie decided to tell him everything anyway. Sean listened in silence, only occasionally asking some clarifying questions. "Yeah, apparently your husband decided to get rid of you in such an awful way. I can't fail to note his ingenuity in this matter. If it weren't for my dog Buddy, his plan would have worked," Sean summed up at the end of the story. Goldie shrugged and looked sadly at little Billy, who couldn't walk properly because of his limp. Deep down, the woman already knew that she was going to try and help the boy, but first she needed to deal with her husband. As soon as she started feeling better, Goldie persuaded Sean to take her to the city, where Jeffrey was preparing for the funeral of his wife, pretending to be devastated over her death. The funeral was supposed to take place in the local chapel at around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Goldie's friends and acquaintances couldn't believe her tragic death, but the fact remained, and the closed coffin standing on the pedestal served as a clear confirmation of the woman's death. As is customary of such occasions, Jeffrey stepped up and began to give the eulogy. The man prepared his speech in advance, well aware that every single word he was saying was a lie. Jeffrey was already rubbing his hands, anticipating the wealth he'd get as inheritance when he heard someone applauding him from the depths of the hall. The young widower turned around convulsively and saw a woman in a hood pulled to her very eyes. The stranger came closer and only then showed her face. "Goldie, it's Goldie Rogers," a whisper swept throughout the crowd of the grieving people. Jeffrey turned pale and involuntarily took a couple of steps back. "Don't even try. You won't get far anyway. You didn't give me a single chance in that forest, but I survived. Now you get ready for my revenge," Goldie exclaimed, thus finally making her husband understand that it was all over. At that moment, 2 police officers approached Jeffrey and snapped the handcuffs on his hands without any further ado. Goldie turned around and waved at Sean Williams. All this time, the ranger was there to support the woman in such a difficult confrontation. 3 months went by. During this time, little Billy underwent surgery in one of the best clinics in the country and was now recovering. Sean and Goldie's friendship developed into a romantic relationship full of dates and walks